Welcome to the Father on Purpose podcast, featuring author and ministry leader Kent Evans and business executive and military veteran Lawson Brown. This is a show for you, Dad. You want to be a godly and intentional father. Unfortunately, you've turned to these two knuckleheads for help. Let us know how that works out for you. Before we begin, remember this: you are not a father on accident. So go be a father on purpose. Please welcome your hosts, Kent and Lawson.
All right, hey, welcome to the Father on Purpose podcast. And Lawson and I are super pumped today to get to host a gentleman from Lexington, Kentucky named Scott Nickell. Scott, thank you for joining us, brother.
Hey, thanks for having me. Despite the background behind me, I assure you I am in Lexington, Kentucky.
Scott came into the podcast today with a famous picture right behind him of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, but Scott's in Lexington.
Yeah, this podcast was delayed because of my tech savvy, so I decided just to leave that alone. I'm not sure why that's behind me, but we'll deal with it.
Some things we're just going to leave alone. I'm coming off, actually, just a couple weeks ago, I was in Lexington with you, Scott, when we recorded your Locker Room podcast. So dads, listen, if you're listening to this right now and you need another podcast to help you get all the way to your commute or finish your workout, you really should check out the Locker Room podcast from Southland Church in Lexington, Kentucky. Scott had me on a couple weeks ago, but beyond just the episode with me, he has really great conversations with guys about things related to manhood, biblical manhood, church stuff, parenting stuff, really great series of episodes. And I've listened to several in the past and really appreciate what you're doing, Scott. Let me start by asking you, would you mind giving us a quick sort of 411 on Scott Nickell? What do you do for a living? How long you've been married? How many kids you've got? Give us the kind of the fatherhood and work profile for you.
Yeah, I grew up around Lexington. I've been married for 22 years. It'll be 22 years in December. I have 4 kids. I have a daughter who just entered into college. She's 18. And then I have 3 boys. I have a 16-year-old, a 13-year-old, and a 9-year-old. So
wow,
that's my world. I'm a pastor here at a church called Southland Church. And yeah, that's me, man.
And you're originally from the great state of Kentucky.
Yeah, all my roots are here. My parents met at UK, and so both sides of my family go way back in Kentucky. I graduated from high school here, and then went to college up in Cincinnati. Came back to Southland to start in ministry when I was 18 years old. I was an intern here, and then went full time when I was 20, and so. Did a stint from 98 to 2006 here. And then my family and I, when we had 2 babies, we moved out to Boulder, Colorado, and we were there for 11 years.
Wow. I thought so. I saw that somewhere. And I just got back from Colorado on Friday. I was out there for a business meeting. It's beautiful. Did some rock climbing in Boulder a long time ago.
Yeah, man, we were out there for 11 years in Boulder County and came back here in 2017. So that was a wild ride. 2 of our kids were born out there. And so, God called us back here to Kentucky and never dreamed he would do that, but he did. So here we are.
I'm curious, when you have children born in Colorado, do they come out already wearing flip-flops or do you have to put them on later?
Man, so here's the thing. Like, I love flip-flops. Like, Lawson's over there in Florida. Like, if I had my way, I'd be wearing board shorts, a tank top, and flip-flops all day, every day. And that's a very Colorado thing as well. And so it just fit for me. Like, it worked for me. So people here give me a really hard time about wearing flip-flops to the office. And I've only preached in my flip-flops a couple times here, but back in Colorado, that was like standard issue. That was like
good for you.
So,
yeah, bring them back.
Yeah, I'm in.
That's fantastic. What are some things, Scott, that you've observed? I want to dive into some fatherhood topics, and I'll let Lawson kind of chime in here in a second. But as a dad, let me start here. Remind the audience, how old is your oldest?
18.
18. So you became a dad 18 years ago. Did you feel equipped to be a dad when your first child came along? And if not, why not? And if so, why so?
I didn't feel equipped, but I've always suffered from a little bit of overconfidence. Some might call it arrogance, that kind of thing. And I didn't have, my parents were divorced before well, they were officially divorced right after I was born, but I never lived in a house with my dad. So I was just my mom and then whoever we lived with, and we lived with different family members over the years. And so I didn't have any kind of picture of what it looked like to be a intact family, father leading the home, serving, all that kind of, I just didn't have a picture of it. I did have a very stubborn resolve that I was not going to be a statistic. So that played over in my marriage. Like I just made a really firm commitment. I will not get divorced. It's not going to happen. And so I was super excited to be a dad. We had planned on doing the proverbial, let's wait 5 years to have babies, and it didn't work out that way. Landry was born, I think 3 years into our marriage, and Allie had a miscarriage prior to that. So we were off and running with kids. And so I didn't have a clue what I was doing, but I was really firmly committed to figure it out. And I always loved kids. I did kids ministry. And so for me, it was there's definitely fear and trepidation, but it was more the fear and trepidation of moving into a big adventure and something you were excited to do than, so I was not equipped, but I was also super excited to figure it out.
Did you ever come across, spend time with a family that you were like, that's what I want to have?
The closest thing I had was for 2 years, my mom and I lived with her parents in Dallas, Texas. We moved down there so my mom could attend business school at the University of Dallas, and my grandfather, who was a military man, his second career was being a Bible college professor. So in preparation for that, he went to Dallas Theological Seminary. Mm-hmm. So when I was 7 years old till I was 9 years old, and later I found out those years are actually super important in the development in a young man especially, but I got to live in a home with my grandfather, who turned out to be, my hero. He actually just died this past year. So that was the closest thing I had, man. And then after that 2 years was over, it was just me and my mom. We moved to Lexington. And from the time I was in fourth grade till I graduated high school, it was just me and her in the house. So
good for you for, breaking the cycle, or I don't know if that's the right term you want to use, but for saying, I know what I'm going to do regardless of my past. I think sometimes folks can fall into the trap of, well, that's all I knew. That's the way I was raised, how my dad was. And so that's just what I do. And I just don't, I guess I understand that, but I think there are plenty of examples where people have, risen above, gone beyond, broken that pattern. And so I applaud you for, not only have you broken it, man, you're killing it. Well done.
There's a big difference between a reason and an excuse. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like the fact that your dad didn't do it right is a reason that you might not do it right, but to use it as an excuse is an entirely different thing. And so for whatever reason, I was pretty committed to not use it as an excuse, and in fact used it more as like motivation and fuel to do it the right way.
Yeah.
That's a great line. I think that's going to be the episode title. There's a big difference between a reason and an excuse. That's a great line. Before we get off this topic, Scott, I have other questions for you, but along these lines, Lawson and I hear a lot from dads who do use that as an excuse. They'll say, man, I didn't have an example, so I'm just destined to repeat it, that kind of thing. I'd love for you to speak, to like, there's some dad listening who has believed up to today, and maybe today's the day when that changes for him, that he is shackled or hamstrung by his past or by his, birth home or his own dad or whatever. What would you say, and you can go as long as you like, but what would you say to that dad about not just your journey, but even biblically or theologically or, God the Father, like give some dad an encouragement if he grew up in a similar situation with no dad as an example?
Yeah, I try to look at that through the lens of Jesus's baptism. There's a really interesting thing that happens during Jesus's baptism. We're told that it's a voice from heaven that spoke, "This is my son whom I love, with him I'm well pleased." Well, those are the words every man longs to hear from his earthly father. So God the Father claims God the Son. "This is my son whom I love. So not only is the Father not ashamed to identify himself with the Son, but he doubles down and says, and I love him. He has my blessing, but also I'm well pleased with him. So I actually like him, And so imagine, for those of us, which is a lot of us, who came from a place of brokenness where either your dad was absent or your dad was the opposite of a good dad or your dad was abusive or whatever that may be. You were born with a yearning and a desire to hear those words of blessing spoken to you from your father. And what I try to communicate to men is that because of who Jesus is and what he's done for you, the blessing of the Father that rests on him as the Son rests on you as his child as well. And so you actually have everything you need. You have a good Father, and you have his blessing, and you have his gifting. You may not have that in the form of your earthly father, but you have that from your heavenly Father. And so the excuse of, well, I'm just destined to repeat history is really off the table for every follower of Jesus. You are not chained to your past at all. And so that's what I try to steer men toward. And I also, you and I talked about this a little bit, like men tend to really, at times we overcomplicate this. Like, you actually can do this, man. Like, you can do this. Like, you can serve and you can lead. This doesn't have to be rocket science, So getting around some other men that have maybe a little further down the path or come from similar stories is always really helpful as well.
I like how you don't mince words, Scott, and you're not. No, I'm serious, man.
But he's friendly about it.
Yeah, really.
He's friendly about it.
Yeah, I like it. Before we started, I was sitting out with coffee with my youngest daughter. I said, just from what I can gauge, I think I'm going to really like this guy. Seems like my kind of guy. I've heard you talk a couple of different places about in America fatherlessness and something that it just bugs me so badly about how pop culture presents dads. Like every sitcom, every commercial, the dad role is like joke worthy, kind of eye roll, and like the kids are disrespectful and the dad's just a buffoon, and and it just bugs me to death. And that is the opposite of what I believe our society is in need of to help address fatherlessness. And you've gone on podcasts, or you've from the pulpit, your sermons have addressed some of that. What do we tell dads about accepting their role as important and critical in the lives of not only our own families and our own children, but in the broader context of society, to break this mold of, the dad you see in a commercial who's just an idiot walking around, doesn't know anything?
Yeah. Fathers are a force to be reckoned with, for good or for bad. I mean, consider the fact that just the mere absence of the father has such a powerful impact on the trajectory of a child's life, right? So if you're not there, then we go through all the statistics, right? You're this much more likely to go to jail. You're this much more likely to produce another child out of wedlock. You're this much more likely to drop out of school. You're this much more likely to commit a violent crime. You're this much more likely to commit suicide. I mean, right on down the list, all the stats that all three of us could, have read ad nauseum. So the role of the father is so powerful that when it's not being played out, it has that huge of an impact on children. That's the negative side. On the positive side, your sheer presence in your children's life, by just you being there, even if you're a bump on the log, your kids, statistically speaking, are already going to be that much further ahead than kids who don't have a father in the home. Now imagine what would happen if you actually tried. Like, what would happen if you actually put a little bit of energy into this? And then imagine what would happen if you put both shoulders behind this and asked and pleaded with God the Father to send his Holy Spirit to empower your efforts. Then all of a sudden amazing things can happen. So So fathers are a force to be reckoned with for good or for bad, and our culture is absolutely terrified of them. The real version of masculinity, I don't like the phrase toxic masculinity. I prefer to use the phrase counterfeit masculinity. I think a lot of what we see in culture is a counterfeit version of masculinity. If it's masculine, like there's a sense in which in our culture we're saying if it's masculine, it must be toxic. And I just don't buy that at all. So anyway, I just tell, men, listen, you are a force to be reckoned with. Jordan Peterson talks about being a monster, being
right. I've heard that.
Monster. I think there's something to that. I think there's really something to that. And when I look at Jesus, there's a word that I've been obsessed with lately. It's the word ferocious. It means fierce, intense, and savage. And there's a sense in which Jesus is absolutely ferocious in the right ways, for the right reason, for the right people. And so that's what I try to challenge fathers to be, is just a ferocious force for good. Like when my daughter was born, like you guys probably have similar stories, like the first thought I had when I saw her, besides the fact that I couldn't believe she survived the process, they had to like use like stuff. I was like, I can't believe a human head can be that pliable.
Right, yeah.
Beyond that was, I would die for you. And my very next thought was, I would kill for you,
Yeah.
Well, I don't know what the word you use for that other than ferocious, And I think in the church, the problem is we've so tried to neuter men into being nice, which is not the same as being kind. So men have walked into churches and felt like they've been challenged to become feminized, when what they need to be challenged to is to be masculinized like Jesus, Sorry, I'm preaching. So
no, I love this strain that we're on. It's like society applauds emasculation, like, oh, you're doing the right thing by emasculating this role of father figure. And I just want to say, like, look, if we can't agree that all fathers are good, which that's pretty easy to argue, can we at least compromise and agree that no father can be bad?
Right. or that anybody can't be a father, so a woman can't be a father, So that's a very politically incorrect thing to say, but it happens to coincide with reality. I can't be a mother, but our culture doesn't want to admit that at all. Much of that's because of the sexual revolution, because of this idea that, anything a woman can or a man can do, a woman can do better, without acknowledging the differences between men and women and why those are good and important.
What I think's interesting is when you stack up a lot of the worlds and the cultural approaches to certain philosophical underpinnings, I find it almost comical how quickly they tend to break down. So for example, we would say we want to value diversity. And what we mean a lot by that in current modern era is racial diversity or ethnic diversity. And we should, absolutely. Like, why wouldn't we? Jesus pulled all kinds of people in on the play, right? He was one of the most diverse leaders in history. But what's interesting is we can't say, or we can, I guess, until the podcast gets shut down, we can say, it's really great for feminine women to be feminine. Like, that's awesome. And for masculine men to be masculine. But we won't celebrate that diversity. So the diversity of roles of men and women, we never go, oh, that's really cool. How like Kent and April, my wife, how we complement each other. April and I went on a walk last night, Scott, and we were talking about a particular reaction to something in our family that she saw one way and I saw another way. And we weren't like violently opposed, but we were definitely pulling on the thread from two ends. And we both acknowledged probably in the middle was the wisdom. But whatever we were holding in tension between her perspective and my perspective was probably more true than either of our perspectives. And I find it so comical how we'll value diversity in one context, but we won't value diversity in another context if it bumps up against some other script we're trying to run or play we're trying to run. Let me pivot just a hair a little. Which, by the way, I'm glad a moment ago you went from, hey, if you're a total failure and then you become a bump on a log, you're better. And then you raised it because I didn't want to end the podcast with, hey, dads, today's podcast is about if you just become a bump on a log, You have actually
That's
succeeded.
good enough. Yeah.
Tell your wife, honey, Scott Nickell said, I'm a bump on a log and you should be grateful. Don't do that. Don't do that. What I'd like to know, though, is as you've navigated this, both theologically as a pastor, but also just experientially as a guy running around with other guys and men in your church context you've worked, but personally, what have you found to be some of the more difficult challenges of fatherhood? When you think about, man, I've really had to either figure this out or I'm still figuring this out, or here's a big challenge I did have or do have. When I say challenges to being a dad, what are some of the first couple things that come to mind, either for you personally or in things you've seen in your kind of church circle?
Yeah, years ago I read a book, and I hate parenting books. I hate them. I loathe them, like, because so often what happens is people who, man, number one, the level of confidence you have to be able to write a parenting book, So usually they become really prescriptive, and a lot of times it feels like people are trying to sell you something that worked for one kid one time, maybe, on paper. But a guy named Paul Tripp, who I really, really like, and has written a lot. We spoke at a conference together for a few years. He wrote a book on parenting with a really catchy title. It's called Parenting. and the biggest
for those dads trying to find that book, it's Parent.
ENT. I did a series kind of based on it years ago in Colorado called Parent Fail, and I just wanted to be really transparent as a parent about the fact that, man, we all feel like a failure so much of the time. Like I can't think of anything else in life that's more humbling than being a parent, and that Satan tries to leverage to tell you you're a total failure, you're screwing up your kids, and why even try? Why even bother? And so then in the sheer exhaustion of it, the frustration of it, we just give up. And I think one of the most profound things that Tripp talks about in that book is this idea of identity parenting. So, and one of the things that I've taught consistently in my ministry is that if you make a good thing an ultimate thing, it will become a destructive thing. So God's good gifts can be very, very, very dangerous things if you turn them into an idol. And Paul Tripp writes about this far better than I ever could. But when he talks about identity parenting, he talks about this idea of how if we try to get our identity from our kids, if we turn them into little gods, little idols, kids make terrible gods. And what ends up happening is we heap all this pressure on our kids to deliver.
Wow, that's very interesting.
And they can't live up under that pressure. So it crushes them, and it makes us angry, and it crushes us. Because what happens if you're a mom or a dad of a 3-year-old and you're walking through the grocery store and they have an absolute meltdown in front of God and everybody? If you're getting your identity from that kid's behavior and performance, man, you're going to be crushed. But if you're not getting your identity from that kid's behavior or performance, you're able to go, you know what, this is a bad day. Welcome to life in the Nickell home. Like, this happens sometimes, but it's very freeing to be able to go, okay, man, I like the days where my kids behave. I don't like the days when my kids don't, but who I am is not dependent on that kid's behavior.
Well said.
That has so much to do with their performance in the classroom as they get older, their performance on the ball field. Like if you just go to an average youth sports game today, what you see is identity parenting on display. So you see a whole bunch of people melting down at a coach pitch baseball game, not because of their kid, but because they think their identity is in the batter's box. Who they are is on the line, and if the kid strikes out, they're going to be furiously angry with that kid, or they're going to blame somebody else, or the coach cheated them, or whatever it is. So every time you see a parent melting down out there, that's what you're witnessing, is idolatry on display. And so I don't know where we started this question that led me to this place, but I think that's one of the biggest pitfalls and dangers I've had to deal with in my parenting, has been to go, you know what, and especially as a pastor, because there's all this pressure, because everywhere you go, people are watching you, and they put these expectations on you and your kids and their behaviors. So if your kid gets in trouble at school, or if your kid doesn't act right, or if your kid gets in a fight at the basketball game, there's this strong temptation to double down on your kid because you made me look bad in front of everybody. So I've had to really resist that over the years, and I haven't gotten it right all the time. But I'll tell you this was super interesting the other day. My oldest son, who Kent's heard me talk about a little bit, we had some people over at the house, and he said, people ask me all the time what it's like to have a pastor for a dad. And I kind of leaned in because I was super curious. He's a junior in high school, 16 years old, driving, all that kind of stuff. And I said, well, what do you say? And he said, I don't even understand the question. I just tell him it's normal. I was
wow.
Thank God.
Yeah,
I was like, because this, so you guys, you'll totally get it, but and other people may not get it. But one of my goals has been for this to be as normal as possible for them. I don't want him and the rest of my kids to feel like they have all this extra pressure or eyeballs on them because they're a pastor's kid. And the fact that I've made it 16 years and he just thinks life with dad is normal, like any other kid has life with dad. It was like a huge moment, man.
I bet. Like, good for you. Yeah, because what if he just said, "Oh gosh, it's pretty hard," like there's a lot of pressure on me. Yeah. Dad puts a lot of pressure on me everywhere I go. Yeah, that could have been.
Yeah. I've written a couple of books on fatherhood, and when my kids get asked what it's like to live with an author on fatherhood, they just say, he's a complete two-faced hypocrite. However, please buy his books. We got to eat.
I realized as I was talking about how I hate parenting books, I'm talking about parenting authors. So,
yeah.
Feel free to edit that out,
No, we edit nothing.
That's so good.
I sat down recently with Chris Harper. He's the executive director of Better Man Ministries. And I asked him a question about the state of manhood today. And his answer was both depressing and a bit hilarious. Check this out.
Yeah, it's a dumpster fire. That's what I would say the state of manhood is today. It's not just shaky, it's an absolute dumpster fire. The only categories that men are excelling in are terrible categories like incarceration, suicide rates, depression rates, not attending church, things of that nature. Women are far and ahead excelling beyond men, whether it's graduation rates, college admittance rates, professional degrees, church attendance, spiritual growth. Women are dominating, and it shouldn't be like that. So what's happened to men, in the 90s, we talked a lot about passivity, like men would just be passive. And I still think that's true. Like, we wrestle with passivity, but the reality is men are slow quitting their masculinity today. They're just kind of devolving into the background and becoming non-existent. And it's a serious problem that is affecting every facet of our society.
Better Man is one of our ministry partners. We love what Chris and his team there are doing. If you or your church is looking for a group study for your men to go through that covers the essentials of biblical manhood and helps men have a clear vision of how they can be as a man, they can gain confidence, become the man they want to be, improve relationships, and create a more purposeful life, check out the resources from our friends Better Man. You can find those at betterman.com. That's betterman.com. Yeah, well, one of the things you were saying, Scott, is how we got to where you ended up, and it was you were putting a bow on a package that most dads really need to understand and unwrap, and it's this idea of identity parenting, and that they're living their lives vicariously through their children, and that every one of their children's successes is their parenting success, and every failure is their parenting failure. Lawson's daughters are old enough to be out of the house. I've got two guys at my house that are out of the house, one in college, one married, living in Nashville. And my wife and I have started having those conversations as our kids have started to exit regarding we want to be as involved in their adult life as we possibly can without feeling like every single decision they make as an adult is somehow our responsibility or some kind of either vindication of us as parents or, defamation of us as parents, And that's a tricky balance. April and I were talking recently about how in the Garden of Eden, God said, hey, here's what you guys need to do. And then they did the exact opposite. And sometimes I bump into dads or moms who think, well, if I do everything right as a parent, then my kids are going to do everything right as a child. And you just think, so I guess in the grand scheme of things, that would make you a more effective father than God himself. The theology of that's pretty hilarious when you just and they go, well, no, that's not what I mean, but that's how we think, isn't it?
Yep. Yeah. If God the Father, is the perfect father and his kids were still disobedient, and then you have Jesus in Luke 15 give a parable that illustrates something very similar. Here's a great father who still has a rebellious son, so you can be a great father and still have a rebellious son, and that's not indicative of you being terrible.
Right. We generally speaking on the podcast try to wrap some sort of practicality into, the episode, something that can be like a takeaway. Yeah, we try.
Yes.
We want this to be useful and valuable. And I think today, by the way, I think for sure it has. I love what you were saying about identity parenting. I'm gonna hone in on that. You have said before, Scott, what is a father for? And when I heard you say that, I thought, what am I for? I mean, not just what is a father there for, but what is a father? What do I stand for? And you wrapped it nicely in this thought of to be a walking, talking parable of our Heavenly Father. And I loved that. I wrote that down. And what you said was, show them our perfect provider and our ferocious protector. And you put some scripture in there with that, Matthew 6:32 for you guys that are listening, and then also Ephesians 6:4 to help, prop those two thoughts up on the Bible, which is the way you explain that really hit home for me. Talk some about that, because I think it helps with some thought process around, like, okay, so if we're going to accept our importance as a father, what does that mean? What are we here for? What do we stand for? And how do we reflect our Heavenly Father in our children's lives?
Yeah, I think most fathers would go, yeah, okay, I'm here to love my kids. Okay, well, what does love look like? And what does love mean? And provision and protection is specifically what men are called to do in the context of marriage and in the context of parenting. And that Ephesians 6:4 passage is super interesting because it's addressed only to fathers. Fathers, don't exasperate your children, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. Why does Paul seem to think that fathers need to hear specifically not exasperate your children? That word exasperate. Apparently, we have a tendency to put our kids in a no-win situation. We'll have a tendency to back them into a corner where their choice is either to fight or flight. I'm going to come out swinging at you, Dad, because you've provoked me, or I'm just going to run away from you, Dad, because you're intimidating me. And so apparently Paul thinks we have a very unique tendency to do that, or else he would have said parents or fathers and mothers, but he didn't. He said fathers. But he doesn't only tell us what not to do or what to pay attention to try to avoid. He tells us what to do. And this puts a huge load on the shoulders of fathers. He says, bring them up in the training and admonition, or the discipline and instruction, depending on the translation you're looking at. But that word that he uses there was something that was really familiar to people in a Greek context, and Roman context, of paideia. Bring them up to become a certain kind of citizen, to take their place in a certain kind of kingdom. Well, in the Roman world, that had a very, specific, idea of being a Roman elite, that kind of thing. But in the Christian realm, what does that mean? I want my child to be right at home in the household of God. I want them to feel and be right at home in the kingdom of God. I want them to think God's thoughts after him. I want them to see the world the way Jesus sees the world and love the world the way Jesus loves the world. And in order for them to become those kind of people, I have to take it on as my responsibility that they be trained in that way from the time they're born until the time that they leave my house. So that means the conversations we have, the values we hold, the way we interact inside our home and outside our home needs to reflect that. And we're going to get it wrong a lot. We're going to fall very, very flat all the time. But we're going to do it in the context of a home where we know that the relationship is never on the table. So if you mess up or I mess up, that doesn't mean that we're now out of relationship with each other. It just means that we have to move back towards each other, ask for forgiveness, and keep on going. So I always think that dads walk around in our context not understanding what a high calling they've been given, and that has the tendency to make us give way to what I think is the number one sin that men struggle with, and that's passivity. We're passive, and we abdicate our responsibility. And what we're doing when we do that is we're overloading usually the women in our life with more than what they were meant to carry. And so, you went to the Garden of Eden. We can go back to the Garden of Eden. Where was Adam while Eve was having this conversation with the enemy? Well, the text says he was right there with her, and a lot of people have tried to dance around that for a lot of years to think that like Adam he was away while Eve went astray. That was actually a Puritan proverb. But she turns and she gives the fruit to Adam right there in that moment, And so here we have Adam being passive and abdicating instead of intervening between Eve and the enemy. And so I think when we abdicate, terrible things happen. And so, the challenge is for men to step up and take that responsibility.
It is a challenge. You also there is an old parable. Something to the effect of I'll mess this up, and I don't think that it's biblical. I'll say something extra about that, but it's you said about love your children, and mirror and model that from Jesus. The parable is share the love of Jesus with everyone, and occasionally use words. And when I say that's not biblical, what I mean is. That doesn't mean don't use words. I'm talking to you, a preacher who, by the way, dude, Scott Nickell, you are my new pastor. I love this. I love you. I'm going online. I'm going to be a Southland viewer online. So you're
Lawson, have you already sent your donation in?
Yeah, that's the next question.
I mean, Scott's probably not going to say it, but I want to make sure I help him out.
No, we'll work to go fishing down there in Florida.
So
yeah, I think Francis said that. It was like preach the gospel and use words if necessary or something.
And so how do dads, what does that entail to us as dads about showing our kids love?
Yeah, what I've always said is the problem with that quote is the Bible. So words are necessary, but they're not the only thing that's necessary. And if all we do is spout words, which is it's definitely my tendency. Like I can go preach sermons at my kids, and like I'm writing a sermon right now that talks about we're looking at Paul's letters and writing to Timothy. The idea of do as I say, not as I do has never worked. Like the youngest child sees the hypocrisy in that statement and rolls their eyes, right? But as dads, we have a tendency to just want to give speeches instead of just live it. And so the truth of the matter is our kids are paying a lot more attention to who we are and what we do than what we say. And if there's a mismatch between those things, which often there are, they can be tolerant of the fact that we make mistakes too, but we need to admit those mistakes and call attention to them and ask for forgiveness, as opposed to just skirting past them and living in a hypocritical way in front of our kids, because that teaches them something, So yeah, I think a couple things practical, to get real practical, is fathers show up. One of the things that my dad did really, really well, that I tell this story all the time, because my parents were divorced in the era where women got custody and there was no shared custody stuff. So my dad had every other weekend, 6 weeks in the summer, and then alternating holidays and stuff like that. So, and we never lived in the same town. He always lived at least a couple hours away. So I always tell the story of when I played baseball here in town. Every week I pass this old baseball field. It's not used anymore, and I always think of this. I played third base when I was 9, 10, 11, and 12 years old, and my dad would come down on weekends and watch me play. And on the weekends he had visitation. We would stay like in a hotel around here in Lexington. But there was always a midweek game too. There was always like a Tuesday night game or Wednesday night game or something like that. And I have vivid memories of standing on third base and being 2 innings in and seeing my dad come peeling into the parking lot in his 1987 Pontiac Sunbird, hop out of the car in his business suit with his tie, undone and his jacket thrown over his shoulder or whatever, running to the bleachers to watch me play. And he would watch 4 innings, maybe 3, and he would give me a hug, talk for a little while after the game, and then drive 2 hours back to Cincinnati or 3 hours back to Indianapolis. And so even though my home was broken and my dad didn't do everything right, the thing he did do right was he showed up. And that, made such an impression on me that meant I don't miss anything with my kids. If I miss something, it is extraordinary, So just showing up and being present. So many dads are so absent. They're out at a golf course.
Well said. Very
guys give
well
me crap
said,
about
dude.
making
Thank
fun
you.
of golf all the time. And the reality is actually, I really like golf. Like I played a lot of golf when I was younger, but I started having all these babies and I realized, man, what it costs me to be gone for 4.5, 5 hours on a Saturday is not worth it, and what it costs my family. And so, man, I may play more golf when my kids are grown. I may not. I may fish a lot more when my kids are grown. I may not. But the reality is I get this really brief window with them to be present, and just being present, because that's when those conversations occur. That's when those teachable moments occur. That's when life actually happens. That's when, the metal meets the meat. And so, dads, if you'll just be present, and if you'll intentionally be around the home and be a presence in the home, so much will head in the right direction.
Man, what a great word. I remember the book that came out probably 20, 25 years ago now, Scott, called Point Man by Steve Farrar. And then they re-released it recently this year, and he passed away a few months ago. And one of my very favorite books of all time. And I'd still recommend it. And when I speak in front of guy audiences, I'm like, who's read Point Man? And like 10% of the hands go up, or 5. And I'm like, oh my goodness, what a travesty. You guys got to read that book. And he talks in that book about the myth of quality time.
That's right.
And he says, all you can do is create quantity time.
Quantity. That's right.
And then you're going to accidentally find quality in the middle of the quantity. But if you just go, hey, we're going to do 10 minutes and it's going to be high quality, you're just never going to find it. And your word about just physically being there as often as you can, even to your point about your dad, even if your home is not ideal or nuclear or it's broken or there's distance issues or you got a demanding job, just you physically being present creates those opportunities.
Yeah. And here's the other thing, if you put so much pressure on your time to be quality time, like, you can take this out of parenting and apply it to your wife and go, hey, if your wife goes, hey, tonight between 6:30 and 7, we're going to have some quality time. In my mind, that means something that, I know what
she probably didn't mean.
I know what 30 minutes quality time means in my mind. It's not what she's thinking. So, but if you put all that pressure on it, it's not going to deliver. To your point, those things happen organically. And so some of the best conversations and moments I've had with my kids have been unplanned moments that just occurred. And had we not been present with one another, they wouldn't happen.
You were physically present and there together, and then that moment comes. It's not like, okay, in 5, 4, 3, here we are now on our quality time.
Quality starts now. Well, I want to give you, Scott, kind of the last word. But before I do, I just want to say, number one, thank you for joining us today. I'm sure whoever's listening to this show has benefited greatly from your wisdom, your humility, and your humor and your transparency. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for having me on your show. That was a blast. Had a great time with you. And then third, I just want a quick shout out about Southland. The church Scott works at is in Lexington, Kentucky. And that is where I was baptized at the time of recording this episode, almost exactly to the week, 31 years ago. I was baptized in just a few weeks. I'll celebrate my 31st baptism as a college kid, chasing a pretty girl into church. And so I have such an affinity for Southland and what you guys do there. And so if this podcast is horrible and tragic and theologically unhinged, it's basically Southland's fault. Kind of the way I look at it, Scott. You guys set all this in motion, so you're responsible for every single downstream effect. But give us a kind of a last word to dads. I think you've hit on a bunch of the key topics. I think being a dad is hard. It's difficult. It has its own unique set of challenges. What would you say to a dad out there who needs some encouragement? And we're just going to let you kind of close the show.
Yeah, I want to acknowledge the huge force that is set against men, and Satan does not want to see men thrive. He does not want to see men thrive in their marriages. He doesn't want to see men thrive in their parenting, So, acknowledging that the reason you feel like you wake up every day in the middle of a war is because you do. Now, and I'm not a huge Lord of the Rings fan, but I sometimes will misquote it or roughly quote it. There's a scene in one of those eternally long movies where one of the characters says to the other, I won't risk open war. And the other character responds and says, open war is upon you, whether you would risk it or not. That's a great line because, open war is upon you, whether you would risk it or not. So the choice is, are you going to fight or not? So I would challenge you, if you're a follower of Jesus, you are equipped to fight this war, but you've got to pick up the weapons that you've been afforded. And that means the Word of God has to be absolutely central in your life. You're in the middle of a huge battle, a huge fight, and oftentimes men are trying to just kind of fight it on their own, even though they've got the weapons that Jesus talked about, that Paul talked about at their disposal. So the Word of God has to be absolutely central. The other thing I would say is this: acknowledging that our culture hates masculinity and manhood. C.S. Lewis wrote about this in The Abolition of Man, when he talked about, we laugh at honor, and then I'm paraphrasing, we act shocked to then find traitors in our midst. We castrate and we bid the geldings be fruitful. I'm in horse country, so we totally understand that around here. A gelding is a male horse that's been fixed. Better word would be broken, and I've got a gelding in my pasture with a mare, and she goes into season sometimes, and that means that there's two really frustrated horses in that pasture. And to expect that there would be a baby horse that would come along a little while later would be silly, because he's been castrated, he's been gelded. And so our culture is doing two things simultaneously. It's screaming and yelling at men for toxic masculinity. In other words, you're not being virtuous enough, even though our culture has set up the exact circumstances that will remove the masculinity and the virtue that they so desperately desire. So acknowledging that that's the case, don't listen to a single thing that the world tells you about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a father, and what it means to be a husband, unless they accidentally align that with what the Word of God says to be true.
Wow. Those ESPN shows where they go, "That's an instant classic." I think today's episode is an instant classic, Lawson.
Man, this is
dude,
great. Scott, you are the man. I really appreciate you being here.
Well, I've just been in the battlefield, on the field of battle with a lot of men for a lot of years. And so this is what my heart beats for. And so I'm grateful to you guys for being brothers in arms. I'm grateful every time one of these kinds of podcasts and these ministries arrive, and I pray that you guys will thrive and be able to resource as many men as God would entrust you with. So,
well, hey, along those lines, we need to enlist the listener. Dad, listen, if you found today's show as helpful as I did, I was taking notes. Like half the time I'm supposed to be the show host, but most of the time I was just taking notes. if you found today's show helpful, well, if you didn't find today's show helpful, just don't come back. Like seriously, because if you didn't get that value out of that, you're not going to get value out of anything. Just go on and be a griper and go listen to somebody else's podcast. Go listen to The Locker Room from Southland Christian Church. If you found today's show to be helpful, dads, we need your help. You need to take the clip of the show link and email it to your buddies. Email it to your small group. Share it on social. Rate the show on iTunes or Spotify. Give us some follow so that these algorithmic-based entities will rank our show up and we'll reach more dads. Like, we want Scott's message to get into the ears of thousands and thousands and thousands of dads, and we can't do that ourselves at Manhood Journey and Father on Purpose. We need your help. So, Dad, if you found today's show to be helpful, get out there and share it and rate it. Scott Nickell from Southland Church in Lexington, Kentucky. Thank you, sir, for coming on today and being such a godly dude and a pace setter. And we're super grateful to you for today.
Thanks for having me, fellas. Appreciate you guys.
Hey, Dad, thank you for listening to today's show. If you found this episode helpful, remember, you can get all the content and show notes at manhoodjourney.org/podcast. And if you really liked it, please consider doing 3 things. Number 1, share this podcast with someone. You can hit the share button in your app, wherever you listen to podcasts, or just call a person up and tell them to listen in. Number 2, subscribe to this podcast so you get episodes automatically. That helps us as well to help dads find the show. You can do that through your favorite listening app, whatever that is. And finally, review this podcast. Leave us a review, good or bad, wherever you listen. Those reviews also help other dads find the show. You can always learn more about what we're up to at manhoodjourney.org or fatheronpurpose.org. We will see you next week.
You've been dozing off to the Father on Purpose podcast featuring Kent Evans and Lawson Brown. Now, wake up. Head over to fatheronpurpose.org for more tools that can help you be a godly, intentional, and not completely horrible dad. Remember, you are not a father on accident, so go be a father on purpose.